It is nearly impossible to see from the outside how a person empties, because these people continue giving even as they are emptying. This is what made them so difficult to recognize in my practice. They did not arrive looking depleted. They arrived looking capable, concerned about others, quick to ask how I was before settling into the chair to speak about themselves. And even then, they would often spend the first portion of our time together reassuring me that their situation was not so serious, that others had it worse, that they did not want to take up too much space. That last phrase, they did not want to take up too much space. I heard it in various forms from more patients of this type than I can count, and each time I heard it, I noted the same thing. They were sitting in a chair in my office, having arranged an appointment, having traveled to get there, and they were apologizing for existing in the room. I want to tell you what I came to understand about these people. Not because their situation is unusual. In fact, it is remarkably common, but because the mechanism that drives it is one of the least understood in all of psychological life, and the cost of not understanding it is considerable. These are the people who give everything and ask for nothing. And what happens to them slowly and invisibly is one of the quieter tragedies I encountered in 40 years of practice. Stay with me, because the next part changes the meaning of what giving actually costs. The first thing I want to establish is that this pattern does not begin as a character flaw. It begins as a solution. A very early, very intelligent solution to a particular kind of problem. The child who learns that love in their environment is conditional, that it arrives when they are useful, agreeable, undemanding, learns something important very quickly. They learn that their needs are a liability, that expressing want creates distance, that asking for something risks the withdrawal of warmth, and so they make an adjustment. They become the one who gives, who helps, who notices what others need before being asked, who makes themselves indispensable as a way of making themselves safe. This is not weakness. This is the psyche operating with remarkable efficiency under difficult conditions. The child found a strategy that worked. The trouble is that the strategy was designed for a specific environment, and they carried it forward into every environment that followed, long after the original conditions had changed. I noticed this again and again. The man of 60 who still cannot ask his wife for help without feeling that he is imposing. The woman who has spent 30 years managing her family's emotional life and genuinely cannot locate what she herself desires, when someone finally thinks to ask, the friend who is available at any hour for anyone in distress, and who would sooner disappear entirely than admit that they are struggling. These are not people who lack self-awareness. Many of them are extraordinarily perceptive. They can read a room with startling accuracy. They know when someone is upset before that person knows it themselves. What they have been unable to develop, because there was never a safe context in which to practice it, is the ability to extend toward themselves the same attention they extend so fluently toward others. If you find yourself recognizing this pattern from the inside, I would be glad if you subscribe to this channel, because what I am about to describe is where this pattern eventually leads, and it is important to understand it before it arrives. Let me tell you about a patient I will call Heinrich. He came to me in his early 70s. He had been a physician for 40 years. He was, by all accounts, a man of exceptional dedication, a doctor who remembered his patients' children's names, who returned calls in the evening, who stayed late without being asked, who was, in the language his colleagues used, utterly selfless. He came to me because he could not sleep. He had not slept well in years. He described lying awake with a feeling he could not name. Not anxiety exactly, not sadness exactly, something underneath both of those things. A kind of blankness that frightened him more than either emotion would have. When I asked him what he wanted from his life, he looked at me for a long moment and then said something that stopped me entirely. He said, "I have never been asked that before." He was 73 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in service to others. And no one, including himself, had ever asked him what he wanted. I want to be careful here about what I am saying. I am not suggesting that giving is a problem. Generosity is one of the finest qualities a person can develop. What I am describing is something different. It is generosity that has been severed from the self. Giving that has no relationship to genuine desire or genuine choice. The compulsion to give that functions not as an expression of abundance, but as a defense against the terror of having needs. Heinrich could not sleep, because the self he had buried in order to be useful had not died. It had accumulated. All the unasked for things, all the unspoken needs, all the preferences never voiced and desires never considered, they had not gone anywhere. They had been stored year by year in a part of him he had learned not to visit. And now at 73, with his career slowing and his children grown and the structure of constant demand beginning to loosen, they were making themselves known. But here is what most people miss entirely. The collapse of the person who gives everything does not look like collapse. That is precisely what makes it so dangerous. It looks from the outside like fatigue, like getting older, like needing a rest. The person themselves often interprets it the same way. They tell themselves they are simply tired, that things will improve once this particular pressure passes, that they have always recovered before and will recover again. What they do not see, because they have spent a lifetime looking outward, is that what is failing is not their energy. What is failing is the relationship between the self and the life it is living. The life has become entirely other-directed, and the self, which requires some proportion of attention in order to remain coherent, has been running on diminishing reserves for years. I used the word collapse earlier, and I want to say what I mean by it precisely. It is rarely dramatic. It is not usually a breakdown in the obvious sense. It is more often a gradual disappearance, a hollowing. The person finds that things which once gave them pleasure no longer do, that they feel present in their days but somehow not inside them, that when they are alone with themselves there is an unfamiliar silence where something used to be. They cannot always name what is missing. They only know that something has gone quiet that should still be speaking. In my private notes from those years, I wrote about what I came to call the silence of the depleted self. It is different from the silence of a person at peace. Peace has a quality of fullness. This silence has a quality of absence. The person is there, but the animating presence that makes a person feel like themselves, the genuine desires, the genuine opinions, the genuine sense of what they want from the hours of their life, that has retreated so far that it can no longer be heard clearly. Heinrich described it as feeling like a building that had been thoroughly maintained on the outside and not entered on the inside for many years. The facade was intact, the interior had gone cold. Stay with me, because what I want to describe next is what the return looks like, and it is not what most people expect. The recovery of the self in people like Heinrich is not achieved through learning to receive. That is where most people begin, and it is the wrong starting point. Telling a person who has spent 70 years not asking for anything that they should simply begin asking is like telling someone with a long disused limb that they should begin running. The capacity requires rebuilding before it can be used. What I found to be the necessary first step was something more fundamental. It was learning to notice, not to change behavior immediately, simply to begin noticing the internal landscape that had been ignored for so long. I asked Heinrich to try one thing. Each evening before he slept, to ask himself 3 questions and to write down the first answer that came without editing. What did I want today that I did not allow myself? What did I feel today that I did not express? What would I have done differently today if I had not been thinking about what someone else needed? He resisted this for several weeks. He found the questions uncomfortable in a way he could not articulate. Eventually he told me that what made them uncomfortable was that answering them required him to locate a self that had expressed preferences, and he was not sure that self still existed in any clear form. That admission was the beginning of the real work. There is something I want to say to anyone who recognizes themselves in what I am describing, and I want to say it plainly. The self that went underground when you learned that your needs were a liability did not disappear. Selves do not disappear, they contract, they go silent. They wait in the parts of us we have learned not to visit, but they retain their essential character, and they will make themselves known one way or another when the conditions finally allow it. The conditions that allow it are usually some form of change, a retirement, a loss, a relationship ending, a child leaving, some shift in the structure of demand that has organized your life. When that structure loosens, when there is suddenly space in which the self might expand, what emerges is often experienced as distress because it has been stored under pressure for so long. But it is not pathology. It is the self reasserting itself, and it deserves to be welcomed, even when the welcome is uncomfortable. Heinrich, over the course of our work together, did several things that I found remarkable in their simplicity. He began taking one afternoon each week for something he had wanted to do since his 20s and had always deferred. He began with considerable initial difficulty to tell his wife when he was tired and to allow her to respond to that. He began leaving his clinic at the scheduled time rather than staying until everyone else's needs had been met. These are not large things, but for a man who had organized his entire psychological life around the premise that his own needs were secondary, they were enormous. And what he reported gradually was not the dramatic transformation that people sometimes hope for. It was something quieter and more durable, a returning sense of being inside his own life rather than administering it from a slight distance. Before we close, I want to offer you something very small and very practical. Tonight or tomorrow, find one moment in which you notice what you want before you notice what someone else needs. You do not have to act on it. You do not have to reorganize your life around it. Simply notice it. Simply register that it exists. Give it the few seconds of attention it is asking for before the habit of outward attention reasserts itself. That is all. One small moment of recognition. But for people who have spent years without it, one small moment is where everything begins. What is the thing you have wanted for a long time that you have never allowed yourself to name out loud? You do not have to share it here. But I would be glad if you sat with the question. Leave in the comments whatever you are willing to say. There is a thread that runs from this conversation into the question of what the psyche does when it has been neglected for a long time, how it signals its own distress, and what those signals mean. That is worth continuing another time. I want to return to something I mentioned earlier because I think it deserves more space than I gave it. I said that the pattern of giving everything and asking for nothing begins as a solution, and I want to add something to that. It also tends to attract a particular kind of person into the life of the one who carries it. People who give without limit and ask for nothing are, in the language of the unconscious, an extraordinary arrangement for anyone who has difficulty tolerating the discomfort of reciprocity. They are the person who will always be there, who will never burden you with their own needs, who will manage quietly and without complaint whatever arises, who will interpret your neglect as their own inadequacy rather than your failure. This is not a conscious calculation on the part of those who are drawn to them. It is an unconscious recognition. The depleted giver and the unconscious taker find each other with a reliability that I found, across many years of clinical work, almost uncanny. They fit together in a way that serves neither of them. I raise this not to assign blame. Both positions are the product of early psychological learning. But people who are working to understand why they are depleted sometimes do not see the full picture. They see their own giving. They do not always see how the structure of their relationships has been organized around it. Heinrich eventually came to see this clearly. He had surrounded himself across a lifetime with people who needed him, colleagues who relied on his availability, a family that had organized around his selflessness, friends who called when they were in difficulty and were largely absent otherwise. He had not chosen these people out of masochism. He had chosen them because they were familiar, because the dynamic of being needed felt like the closest available approximation of being loved. When he began to change the terms of these relationships, to allow himself to be unavailable sometimes, to voice his own difficulties, to ask for things in return, some of those relationships could not hold the change. They had been built on a particular arrangement, and the arrangement was no longer available. He grieved these losses genuinely, but what replaced them, slowly, were relationships of a different quality, ones in which something was actually exchanged, ones in which his presence was wanted rather than simply required. He told me, near the end of our work together, that the strangest part of the whole experience was discovering that being wanted felt entirely different from being needed, that he had confused the two for so long that he had not known there was a difference, and that being wanted, it turned out, was what he had been looking for all along.